Avia, how are you?
Good.
As
How
you
are
can,
you doing?
decked out in a suit. It was a important person I had to meet, but never mind. Perhaps your viewers will like the fact that I'm in a
Yeah.
suit. I look,
Yeah.
I look
Look.
distinguished. This,
y-
mm,
Yeah. Exactly. You look different. Yes.
mm.
So, yeah. What a week. we.
What a week!
My suspicion is from now on, probably every time we met, we will start with "What a week."
Well, I think it was Lenin who said that sometimes, in a week, 100 years happen,
Yeah.
and sometimes in 100 years, only a week happens. And clearly, we're in the
Yeah.
first type of week.
Yeah. So let's start with the Julian Assange. What's the latest? What can you tell us?
Yeah, I have two friends who are attending the hearing at the moment. One of them, who is a reporter from a German media outlet, he's actually physically in the courtroom and he's keeping me updated. Yesterday, um, Assange's lawyers presented his case. Everybody agrees, everybody, when I mean by everybody, all the people who understand these things, agree that he should win. uh, the legal arguments in his favor appear to be overwhelming. And the view of most of the people who were there is that the judges seem to be in agreement, and they were nodding their heads and appearing to show signs of approval. The problem is, we've been in this situation before with this case, where it looks as if there really isn't any argument, and it's impossible to imagine that the court can come to a decision that is against him, and then the court just does. So we can't be certain. I'm also getting reports today. It's the American side that's putting their case, and apparently it's completely unconvincing, and it has obvious holes, and the judges are apparently um, asking some very searching questions. But as I said, I've learned from bitter experience to assume nothing. So we'll have to wait and see. We'll probably, possibly get a decision today, but the full reasons for the decision will take some. We'll have to wait for them for several days, and it is not impossible that the court will delay giving its final order and its final decision for some time. So we may know where it's going by this evening, but then again, we might not. It's all very terrible. And I should say he apparently is extremely ill. He couldn't face attending the hearing, even by video link. He was offered a video link. I mean, he's in a terrible state. And again, the cruelty of this whole affair is just off the scale.
Yeah, the problem with this case is really not a legal case, right? It's a very political. Well,
Well, you've just, can I just interrupt, because that's
yeah.
exactly the point that his lawyers were making yesterday.
Okay.
This is a political case. It's been a political case all along, and the legal principle, always in theory followed by Britain, by England, going all the way back to the 18th century, is that England does not extradite people in political cases who've been charged with political crimes. And there was case after case after case that the lawyers were able to cite in which this principle was clearly and fully set out. And the judges were absolutely nodding and in agreement about this. There's also another factor, which I wasn't aware of until yesterday, which is that, of course, England also has a policy of not extraditing people to countries where they might be executed, even
Mm-hmm.
criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And the point is that the United States has given assurances that if Assange is extradited to the United States, he will only, if convicted there, face humane prison conditions. But the Americans were very careful not to say that he might not be executed. He might be executed. They could expand the charges against him, include charges of about terrorism and things of that kind, which carry the death penalty, and he might if convicted, be executed on these charges, and the Americans are given no promise that they won't do that.
Yeah, and the whole thing, the death penalty in the U.S., I think, is very strange because it's not regarded as cruel and unusual. Death penalty is not regarded as cruel and unusual because the Constitution said you cannot punish people using cruel and unusual method, but U.S. still has, death penalty. So that itself is very strange to me. Um, and then since it is a political case, I actually find it's very strange that the Biden administration doing what they're doing, because they are not the one who indicted him. It was William Barr under Donald Trump who indicted Julian Assange. I don't know why the Biden administration doesn't use this to their advantage. Just drop the charges, and then he could be taking the high ground, saying, I'm the one who protect the First Amendment. Not only that, he could even say something like, you see, you guys think I'm senile, my brain is not functioning. But on this matter, I clearly have better judgment than Donald Trump, my opponent. Why don't they do something like that? Take advantage of the situation that Donald Trump is the one who indicted him. I actually think he can win some votes. I actually think he can. What do you
Oh,
think?
I think he could win lots and lots of votes. But the problem is, if he does that, he's going against the people in the United States who probably have the real power, who are the intelligence and security agencies. They are the people who have been driving this case. The first steps to prepare this case against Julian Assange were taken whilst Barack Obama was president. And it continued through the time when Donald Trump was president. And of course, it's continued through the time that Joe Biden is president. Now, it seems that Obama was queasy about the case. It seems that at one point, Donald Trump actually seriously considered granting a pardon to Assange. And of course, we don't know what is going on within the Biden administration. But in the case of Obama, it was impossible, apparently, to stop this legal machinery being put in place. And it appears that when Trump wanted to pardon Assange, he was warned that if he did that, various Republican senators would support Democratic moves to impeach him. So this is the problem. It's not what the American people think. It's what the people who hold and exercise real power in the United States want. Now, of course, if Joe Biden was a strong, clever man, he would nonetheless probably do what we say he should do. After all, what would the intelligence and security agencies do in that case? I mean, they're hardly likely to back Trump. But I don't get the sense that Joe Biden is a strong and intelligent man.
Yeah, you're right. The problem is, the security apparatus, they are the one in control. Yeah, that's just, a lot of the problem in the US, that's where it is. Yeah. And then
It is
also,
indeed. And can I just quickly add something? Because,
yeah,
this is an important point to make here, because this is a fundamental difference between the United States and China and Russia. Because in China and Russia, it is the political leadership that controls the intelligence and security services. In the United States, it is the other way around. And that is something that people in the United States and across the world need to understand. When people talk about the differences in the political systems between these various countries, that is one of the single most important political systems. So in China and Russia, you know who is in ultimate charge. In the United States, you don't.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, we don't know. And then things we were talking about Assange, we have to talk about the Navalny's death, right? And the hypocrisy here is incredible. Now, Julian Assange is a political prisoner. That one of the things they really upset. Navalny is a political prisoner, but Julian Assange is a political prisoner. Nobody bothered by that. And then regarding his death, Joe Biden said something like, okay, I was not surprised, but very outraged by the reports of death of Alexei Navalny. And
Mm.
Kamala Harris said, let us be clear, Russia is responsible. That was like a 15 minutes after the news came out that Navalny is dead. Now, none of them said a word when Gonzalo Lira, who is a U.S. citizen, was killed in the Ukrainian prison, isn't it? They care more about a Russian than they care about more about a U.S. citizen, isn't it?
You are absolutely correct. I mean, I have nothing to add to the point that you have just made. I mean, just to say this, I mean, Navalny was a political opponent of the government in Russia. He was also someone, and by the way, here I have, I researched 10 years ago as I did a legal research on one of the cases that was brought against him, a fraud case involving a timber company, and for which he was serving part of his sentence for the because he was convicted in that case. And I came to a view which was supported, by the way, by the commentaries and opinions of many eminent legal people in Britain, that had he been charged in England under the English Theft Act on the same facts, he would have been convicted. To say,
Mhm.
so he's got a shady business history, and he's somebody who engaged in political activities against his government, in which he was quite open about the fact that he wanted to overthrow that government. And he engaged in activities in order to try to overthrow that government, which were illegal, like holding illegal protests on the main streets of Moscow, using mostly school children to block the traffic and things of that kind. So eventually he was sent to prison. Sooner or later, even if on the basis of his business activities alone, he would have found his way to prison, given the way in which he conducted his business activities. So we're talking about a complex man. I mean, I don't want to understate the tragedy of what happened to him, but a complex man who made decisions which one can see why they led him to where he ended up. With Julian Assange, you're talking about somebody who was a journalist, who conducted journalistic activity, who has committed no crime in Britain, and who acted in a way which in the United States has traditionally been protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. So, impossible for me to see how this kind of case could have been brought against him. And if you research the case carefully, you see very clearly that it is full of holes.
And in terms of Navalny's death, of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theory, and also in China as well. Now, I personally think he died of natural causes because he had seems like he had underlying health issues in the past, right? And but if he were murdered, I would, lots of people in China, and I would agree is that, who has the motive to really do that?
Yeah.
The fact is his death divert the attention from Avdevka's retreat,
Yeah.
neutralized the Tucker Carlson's interview, who I do think gave Putin a little bump, right? And then of course Biden wastes no time to put using this as another reason to push for his 60 billion that he wants to give to Ukraine, etc. So it seems to me like the West has a lot more um, incentives at this point of time. A dead Navalny seems much more useful than an imprisoned Navalny that nobody pays attention to, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. Let's first of all unpack what you just said, because let's begin with Navalny's health conditions. There's no doubt about them. They were extensive, and they, by themselves, might provide a complete explanation for his death. Now, you brought up the case of Gonzalo Lira, who I knew well. He was a friend of mine. I ought to explain to your viewers that I had that connection with Gonzalo Lira. Now he also had a health condition. we actually know an awful lot about the conditions in which Gonzalo Lira was held in Ukraine. And all the information that we have is that the Ukrainian authorities, who also brought a completely phony case against him, deliberately mistreated him, and that he was in fact um, physically abused by other prisoners in the prison where he was held at the instigation of the Ukrainian authorities who wanted to kill him. And we also know that a very important and powerful lawyer from Switzerland had been sent to investigate his case just before Gonzalo died by one of the major agencies that is concerned about the conditions of prisoners. So he died just before that investigation into his conditions could be carried out by that lawyer. So you have a very much clearer case about Gonzalo than you do about Assange. The facts are very much stronger about Gonzalo, and you are absolutely correct in pointing out that he was an American citizen exercising his rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution. He was doing YouTube videos from Ukraine, but they were in English and they were being broadcast to an American audience primarily. And of course, he was not engaged in espionage, those kind of activities, or the kind of political activities that Navalny was engaged in. There's a very, very strong case there. So that's the first thing to say. You're absolutely correct. There is good reason to think that this might have been a death by natural causes. The second point to make is you're equally correct in saying that there is no conceivable or logical or possible or plausible incentive for Vladimir Putin and the officials around him to have murdered Navalny now. Navalny's popularity in Russia collapsed a long time ago. It went into even further decline after the conflict in Ukraine started, because most Russians assume that he is an American stooge. Some believe, many believe that he's a CIA asset. I don't know whether or not that is true or whatever. So there is no conceivable sense in which he posed any kind of threat today to the Russian government. And moreover, you're also absolutely correct in saying that the timing from President Putin's point of view looks extremely strange. He's just won a big victory. His army's just won a big victory in Avdevka. He's just had a very interesting and successful interview with Tucker Carlson. He's politically doing very well. Why would he want at this point in time to remind everybody about Navalny and, have stories spread around about the fact that, he's actually this cold-blooded murderer who kills people like Navalny? It doesn't make any sort of sense. Now, about whether the Western powers murdered Navalny, I don't know. I mean, it would be rather concerning if they have an ability to reach out and organize a murder in a Russian prison beyond the Arctic Circle. But it does say that Navalny did have a meeting with his lawyer a couple of days before. Maybe the lawyer gave him some medication. Maybe that medication was planted. Maybe all kinds of things happened. I don't know. I don't know anything about this. But if you are looking purely at motive, Putin has none. As you correctly say, the Western powers have actually quite a lot. I mean, he was no longer serving their purposes in a Russian prison. The political capital that he had in Russia had been completely spent. So, you want to distract attention from Tucker Carlson's interview, from the fact that the war in Ukraine is going disastrously wrong, from the president's own problems, his mental health issues and all that. Well, let's say put it like this. If a case like the death of Navalny comes along, it fits in rather well with your narrative agenda. That's all I'm going to say about this, because I don't want to point fingers. when I have absolutely no evidence at all.
Yeah. So it actually serves, I actually think it serves Russian best interest to get to the bottom of this. Actually, I do
Yeah.
think they do need to do an investigation. What happened, right? Is
Yes.
it really
Yes.
natural cause or he was murdered? I mean,
Yeah.
so
I
yeah,
mean,
so they,
there are other possibilities. I mean, one is suicide. I mean, I think
okay.
nobody's talking about this, but he has had a history of depression apparently, and he has all the drugs and all kinds of things. So it's not impossible that being marooned in the Arctic Circle, he thinks he's this great revolutionary leader, but of course he's not. The revolution that perhaps he thought would come hasn't come. He's faced 30 years in prison. It's understandable he might feel depressed. And, I don't, again, want to speculate too much, but, people in that kind of condition can make these decisions. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, of course, and this isn't to be discounted either. I mean, I had friends of mine who were lawyers who represented people in prison. It's not impossible that some of the prisoners themselves in a prison, became aggressive towards him, and that might have also contributed to this issue, and that might have happened without any instigation from the Russian authorities as well. But you're absolutely right. Proper investigation, full autopsy, um, people from outside being invited to review the results, from Switzerland, from India, from China.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all of that would help.
Yeah. Now about Avdiivka, I would call it defeat, but they call it retreat or whatever. Okay. Um, the numbers I saw is very devastating. I mean, there are different numbers saying there are 1,500 were killed, and then there were still 5,000 trapped there. I mean, there's just all kinds of numbers, and that made me also thinking about the Tucker Carlson interview toward the end of it. Now, nobody talked much about. Putin said something very interesting. He said that clearly that's a real thing happened, that one of the cases was that there were Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded by the Russian soldiers, and the Russian soldiers telling them just to surrender, then you can live, right? And yet those soldiers from Ukraine speaking back, using perfect Russian, saying Russians do not surrender. So until the very end they identify themselves as Russians. So my question is, that raises the question. I find that's very stunning. And that raises the question. Now, if the frontline soldiers still regard themselves as Russians, what are they fighting for?
Yeah, I mean, there is an element of civil war about this conflict, and more people are talking about this. What are they fighting for? Well, they do, many of them do think of themselves as Russians. And there is a historic ideological division. It's a little bit like the north of the United States and the south of the United States during the Civil War. I mean, there are differences in culture, in outlook, in politics. During the Russian Civil War of the 1920s, the one that immediately followed the October Revolution, the people in Russia, what we call Russia today, in Moscow, in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, in the central regions, in the Urals, in the Donbass, they were strong socialists. They supported the Bolshevik Party. They joined the Red Army. They fought to build a socialist system in Russia. The people in Ukraine in general, much more rural society, much more conservative, they resisted it. And so, there is this history of tension and conflict. Now, having said that, it's probably true that over the last 30, 40, 50 years, a distinct Ukrainian national identity has developed. There are differences in language, for example. Ukrainian is a language which is not exactly the same as Russian. In fact, there are differences. They're very closely related. So there is a kind of Ukrainian identity, and it partly draws upon that spirit of resistance that had existed, you know, going back all the way to the 1920s and beyond. But it has been hugely exacerbated by the outside powers who have been telling the Ukrainians, you're better than the Russians, you're superior to them, you are the people who really deserve to be in Europe, and part of NATO, and part of the collective West, whereas the Russians are these Eastern barbarians, the savages, the Asians, Asiatics. Westerners do talk like that. I mean, that's the thing people don't know. I mean, I've come across Westerners who talk like that. So, I mean, that kind of racist outlook is there. And it did win an awful lot of people in Ukraine over. Now, I'm getting the sense this is starting to change. And we're starting to see more and more Ukrainian. I mean, there's a man called Arestovich who was Zelensky's former spin doctor. And he's saying we made a huge mistake. We went with the West. We went with the wrong side, basically. And recently, in the last few days, a Ukrainian frontline brigade, the soldiers in it, said this war is idiocy. We've got to end it. We're tired. We're exhausted. We need peace, and we need to make up with the Russians. The soldiers went public and said that. So I think that this attitude is starting to change, and they're starting to say to themselves, well, more and more of the soldiers are, well, this has gone on for too long. We're not really fighting for ourselves. We've been tricked and fooled and manipulated by the West, and the war has to stop, and we have to reconcile with the Russians now. So I think this attitude does exist in Ukraine, and I think it's increasing. But there are still many people deeply implicated in various crimes, one must say, people who still have their economic and financial interests in the West, people who still believe the stories that the West is has promoted to them. And of course, there are also people who adhere to Nazi and neo-fascist ideologies, which, by the way, the West has encouraged in Ukraine, because it wants some people in Ukraine who are 100% always going to be hostile to the Russians. So there are still people like that in Ukraine who want to continue the war for those kind of reasons. But the ground is shifting. What you said about that comment of Putin's is true, and more Ukrainians are starting to talk like that.
This is such very interesting, because you're totally right. I didn't think about this before, that this is the Western tactic is very effective, that they tell one party that you are superior than the other, right? And in this case, it's Ukraine. Oh, you're better, you're whatever. What they do the same thing. They are doing the same thing in China. They are telling the Taiwan people, oh, you have democracy, so you're better than the mainlanders. They do that, and they say that they do that to the lesser degree in Hong Kong as well. Not mentioning that Hong Kong, based on the Western definition of democracy, Hong Kong never had any elections when Hong Kong was taken by the British, right? It was appointed by the Queen, the governor of Hong Kong, up until China took it back. That's when Hong Kong started to have election. Now, election itself has a lot of problems. So put that aside, right? This is the definition that Western countries use as democracy. Well, they didn't mention that, but they just tell the people in Hong Kong, you have democracy, and so you're better, you're more superior than the mainland, which causes a lot of the hostile feelings towards each other. I think you're absolutely right on that one. And it's very effective.
It's extremely effective, and they've done it in many places. They did it, by the way, in the Northern Caucasus. They did this with the Chechens. They told the Chechens, you're much better fighters than the Russians. The Russians are weak. They're drunk all the time. They did all of those kind of things. And again, the Chechens fought the Russians until they realized that they were being used. And now, of course, they've turned around and flipped, because that's the weakness in the Western approach, because it's very effective, it's very powerful, works in Taiwan. I don't know many people from Taiwan, by the way, but I know I knew lots of people in Hong Kong. And can I say that in my experience, this Western approach to people in Hong Kong, some people in Hong Kong, was extremely effective. They really did believe, well, we got this, amazing legal system here in Hong Kong. The English gave it to us. It's so
Yeah.
much better than what you have in China. We're so we got the wonderful free market, non-corrupt economy, all of that, none of which was true, by the way. I mean, you knew anything about the realities, it was all complete nonsense. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Hong Kong was a British colony run by the British in the most autocratic way. I mean, there was a vast increase in actual, real engagement in their government by the people of Hong Kong when it reunited with China. But there are lots and lots of people who fell for that narrative and still believe in it. I mean, they still fall for that narrative. And this is played constantly and all the time. The problem is when it runs into reality, when it runs against reality, then of course it collapses because it's not based on any fact. So Ukrainians, to just go back to them, I mean, they were told, Western weapons so much more superior than the Russians. Our tanks are better than their tanks. Our infantry fighting vehicles are better. Our training is better. All of those things, except of course, when it turns out otherwise, and you're face to face with it, then of course there's no room for these illusions anymore. And the other thing is, and this is something that I've been hearing, is that Russian soldiers in Ukraine have been shocked by the poor economic conditions they have found in Ukraine. And of course, Ukrainians have increasingly been going to Russia over the course of the war and have been able to contact their people back. Point out that the reality is Russia is much, much more affluent than pro Western Ukraine is.
Exactly the same with the Taiwan. Lots of people from
Mm.
Taiwan, once they got to mainland, they were shocked.
Mm.
They thought the China, lots of the mainland, most of the mainland is still starving. I mean, literally,
Yeah.
there are people believe
Mm.
that. And when they got there, they were like, no, this is not what I heard. This is not what I was told. So that's very, yeah, it's incredible. That's what they're doing. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Now, Putin talked quite a few times about the territories within Ukraine, but used to belong to Romania, Hungarian, and Poland, right? So I wonder whether his end game is he will take as much as he think he can manage, right? The parts that more pro-Russia, more in line with the Russia, and then let those countries take whatever they want to take. That will lead to a very much weaker, much smaller Ukraine. Is that what he's trying to do? That's his end game?
I don't think that Putin has fully worked out his end game because I think that one of the things he realizes is that this is an extremely fluid situation. And going back to what we were saying, it is not impossible that the mood in Ukraine will shift. And even in central Ukraine, for example, in the villages and small towns that make up Western Ukraine, or central Ukraine especially, they will say to themselves, well, do we really want to be part of the West at all? You know, we did well when we were Russians. Let's just go back to being Russians again. And I think Putin is starting to sense this, that there is this mood shift as well in Ukraine. So I don't think he's fully made a decision. But if you're talking about the Putin of, say, 6 months ago, I think at that time, had you asked him, he probably would have said, yes, my end game is very much like you describe it, that we will take the Russian speaking, Russian oriented areas of eastern Ukraine back into Russia because, frankly, that is where they belong. We will allow a Ukrainian state to preserve itself in the central part regions of Ukraine, though we want that state to be friendly to ourselves. and not inside NATO. And the Poles, the Romanians, the Hungarians are welcome to whatever parts of Western Ukraine historically belong to them. And I think the last is probably still true, but I think he might be saying to himself, now, this is how I track his thoughts and comments, including that comment that he made to Tucker Carlson. But, perhaps I can't just turn my back on, the Ukrainians in central Ukraine who were part of Russia for 300 years. Maybe they're coming round to the realization that they're Russians after all. And it will make more sense and will be simpler and actually easier in the end to manage if we just bring them back into Russia and fold them into Russia, preserve their language and identity and all of those things as we used to do, but have them as Russians in Russia again.
Now, I want to ask you now, why did Stalin did what he did, like carve out Ukraine and then put in the territories belong to other countries? Stalin did this whole thing, right? Basically, the Ukraine established because of Stalin. Is that right?
Well, this is, of course, what a lot of people in Russia think, and Putin himself thinks. I'm going to be a little bit more, shall we say, favorable to Lenin and Stalin than Putin currently is, and many people in Russia are. You go back to the time of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. What happened at that time is that right in the middle of the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, Russia was attacked by Poland. It's a war that hardly anybody remembers and talks about. But Poland tried to seize huge territories in Western Russia. And the Russian army, the Red Army, which was winning the Civil War by that point, successfully pushed them back and drove the Poles all the way back to Warsaw. And there was a big battle there, and the Poles pushed the Russians back, and the Russians had to fall back, and the Poles acquired various territories in the west of what used to be Russia, which they incorporated into Poland. And these were the territories, some of the territories that Stalin took back at the end of the Second World War. Anyway, let's just jump ahead. What then happened after the Civil War? And after a kind of peace, or a very cold peace, was recreated between Poland and the Soviet Union, is that the Soviets still had to contend with a hostile Poland backed by the Western powers. They knew that in Ukraine, there were a lot of people who were anti-communist. So they wanted a strong Ukraine that would be allied to them, the Soviet government in Moscow, and which would resist with the Soviet Union a Polish invasion. So that is why they included in Ukraine Donbass, which is a Russian region, and other regions like that, and said, well, that will strengthen our position in Ukraine itself and will ensure that if there is a war with Poland, it will remain loyal. So that was the original thinking, and it's not very well understood today because, as I said, this war with Poland, hardly anybody thinks or remembers it today. Anyway, what then happened was during the Second World War and the period just before, the Soviet Union expanded, well, advanced westward. They ended up incorporating the Ukrainian-speaking territories in eastern Poland, the same territories that Poland had conquered in this Polish-Soviet war. And of course, the people there were ethnic Ukrainians. And the Soviets said, well, we control all the rest of Ukraine. It is illogical, given that these people do not want to live as part of Poland. And that was true, by the way. At that time, Ukrainian nationalism was more anti-Polish than it was anti-Russian. They said, it makes logical sense, therefore, for these regions to join the Soviet Union as well. And that was why Lenin and Stalin did those things. The really weird decision, the one that there is no justification or explanation for, was one that was made a year after Stalin died, when Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who then became Soviet leader, and who, by the way, came from this region, he came from Donbass, took the very odd decision to transfer Crimea, which was a purely Russian region, to Ukraine. Apparently, the people of Crimea didn't want it then, and it was, the rules were violated. Nobody quite understands why he did it, but did it, he did.
Yeah, I actually know somebody in the US when Putin took back Crimea, he was telling me that he called his relatives in Crimea. Everybody is celebrating. You know, it was you know, heavily criticized in the West, but the people on the ground, that they are happy, it seems to me.
Yes.
So yeah.
I mean, the other territorial arrangements had a kind of organic quality. You can see the reason why they were done. The decision to transfer Crimea from Russia to Ukraine was purely arbitrary, and nobody to this day has provided a satisfactory explanation for it.
Okay. Middle East. U.S. just vetoed another UN resolution. Not surprise. You know, no surprise there. But U.S. is supposed to push for its own version of a temporary ceasefire. I don't quite understand. In the meantime, Israel economy collapsed. Their GDP shrank like 20% for the last quarter of 2023. And seems to me like still they still want to continue. They are not going to stop until they take the whole Gaza. Is that what's going on? And I think one of the things that also happened during this week is Iranian gas pipeline there were two of them that was exploded, and Iran accused Israel behind it, which very reasonable to make that assumption. But that seems like that's what Israel's attempt to really draw United States in. Is that what is going on here? But they're not going to stop. They're going to take the whole
you're
Gaza.
absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And what one senses, and on the Israeli side, is that the more difficult the situation becomes, because they haven't been successful in Gaza. Their economy, as you correctly say, is collapsing. Israeli soldiers are being killed, and Israel is becoming internationally isolated. I mean, Brazil has now recalled its ambassador from Israel, for example. And we're having Latin American leaders. Latin America used to be a region which was very, very pro-Israeli, by the way. Anyway, they're becoming very outspoken in criticizing Israel. What is happening is that the Israelis, as they sense this is going wrong, because they can't countenance the idea that they might lose, are now intent on escalating. So they're doing these things with the Iranians, which are unbelievably dangerous. They want to attack this other town in Gaza, Rafah. They're talking in increasingly dangerous terms about what they want to do in Gaza, which is basically drive out all the people and annex Gaza. There is a steady escalation in rhetoric and ambition as the costs grow. The more it fails, the more grandiose and alarming and dangerous the Israelis become. And it's a very dangerous cycle, but psychologically a very well-known one. What makes it really dangerous is that the United States is going along with it. Instead of the United States coming along and saying, stop, this can't go on like this. Your economy's falling apart. Your army's being smashed in Gaza. You're not achieving the objectives that you want. We don't want a wider war. We don't want to get drawn into a war with Iran. Instead of the United States coming along and saying these things, they say, well, we don't want a ceasefire. We want a temporary ceasefire. Or there's the British Labour leader, Keir
That's right.
Starmer says, we don't want a ceasefire, we want a humanitarian ceasefire. I mean, or they engage in all of these games. And again, this has to be connected with the internal politics of the United States and probably the emotional reactions of people like Biden himself, who's said to be very pro Israeli. I mean, but it's stupid. It is stupid policies. You can just about understand why the Israelis are behaving as they are. Incredibly dangerous and foolish as it is. But the Americans, it is beyond understanding. And I know that it has many American officials in despair.
Yeah, and I think it's more than just APAC. I actually think it's they saying it's because APAC, Israeli lobby. I
Mm.
think it's more than that. I think last time you said that Biden himself really want this to go on. I actually think that too. I think he just, whatever the reason, he has a special attachment to Israel for whatever reason, I guess. Just
You are completely correct about this. I mean, the thing to understand is that over 70 years
Mhm.
of this very close alliance between the United States and Israel, every single person, every single official within the American government who was in any way suspected of not being 100% with Israel would lose his job or would not be promoted or be shunted aside. So the result is that you have an entire bureaucratic, political, military, security, foreign policy establishment in Washington that has support for Israel hardwired into itself. And that's almost impossible to change.
Mhm. I think Keir Starmer, I think I saw him somewhere. He is calling for ceasefire now,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but don't you think it's too little, too late? And it's did he sense that the tide have changed, have changed or something? I mean, at some point they will have to come to the realization that this cannot
Yeah.
continue, right? At some point, everybody will call on ceasefire. It will have a ceasefire at some point. Is that,
You are
that right?
You're absolutely right. You're completely correct. But Keir Starmer is a case in point because, of course, he opposed the ceasefire. He gave at the beginning of the impression at the beginning that he was 100% behind Israel. Of course, he's got an internal factional Labour Party issue to resolve because his predecessor, who he hates, Jeremy Corbyn, who is a left wing person, and Starmer, as we know, is on the right of the Labour Party, but Jeremy Corbyn was a strong supporter of Palestinian rights. So everybody ganged up on him, the entire pro Israeli establishment in Britain ganged up on him and said Jeremy Corbyn is an anti Semite. And
Mhm.
Starmer then used anti Semitism as a mechanism to purge his opponents from the Labour Party, all of Corbyn's former supporters. They've been driven out because supposedly they're all anti Semites or sympathetic to anti Semitism and that kind of thing, which, of course, in turn meant that Starmer, by definition, became pro Israel, anti Palestine. Now, what he has discovered is that most of the Labour electorate doesn't agree with him. So he's been pushed very reluctantly and grudgingly into a position which goes against his factional instincts. And he's only doing that because of pressure from below. But that pressure is becoming overwhelming. So he engages in euphemisms. He says, no, no, I'm still supporting a ceasefire, but I do want a humanitarian ceasefire. Well, nobody knows what the difference between the two is, but that's the kind of politician that Starmer is. So eventually, you're absolutely right. This cannot go on forever. There will be a ceasefire. The Israelis are terrified of that because, of course, when it happens, the whole world will see it as a defeat for Israel. And
Mhm.
many people in Israel will see it in that way also.
And this and what Keir Starmer is doing is very typical. I find that the so-called political leaders, they're not really leading us, right? They always follow the people, seems like in most of the cases, right? They are the one who's supposed to pointed to the people, okay, this is the way we should go. And even if people many times people don't see it, it's their job, a leader's job, to educate us, right, to tell us why we should go this way. But what happening now is always the people who are head them. They kind of like in the end come to it. I mean, the farmers' protest is just another example of that. They come around it after people like protest after protest after protest, and this has a lot of protests also going on. The support the Palestinian, etc. Eventually, they will come around, but it is always late. Don't you think they are following the people?
Yeah, we discussed the farmers and how that was driven from below as well, and how the political class didn't want to agree with the farmers' demands until they discovered that the vast majority of people across Europe support the farmers, and that made them, weaken their hostility to the farmers. That's the same about Palestine. But you see, the problem is, it's not just a question of the fact that these leaders lack the ability to lead. It's also that they lack the capacity to lead, because good leadership is based upon an understanding of the realities. It should have been obvious, if we're talking about the situation in Gaza, right at the start of the conflict in Gaza, that the Israeli objective of defeating Hamas militarily is unachievable in any way that does not involve colossal civilian casualties. It should also have been obvious that Israeli politics is now going in a very dangerous direction towards very extreme positions, driving out the Palestinian people from Gaza, recreating the temple in Jerusalem, doing those very, very dangerous things. And had Western leaders taken all of that into account, they would have made decisions which they could have explained to their people and which their people would have supported, because they would have been based on actual facts. People are very prepared to be led if they feel that their leaders know what they're doing. But Western leaders don't operate in that way anymore. They have very narrow, very ill-informed factional views, and they take them in completely the wrong direction. And that's why they're led by events and are never in control of them. Again, I speak to you about these things because this is, I know Chinese people are watching this program. The fundamental difference, again, with the Chinese government and the Russian government, but we're talking about China now, is that if you follow and track what the Chinese government does, how it makes decisions slowly over time based on a very, very careful analysis of the factual situation. And it always does so through a clear understanding of Chinese national interests. So there is a consensus in China behind them. Decision making that way is coherent, and it is consistent, and it is strong, and it is supported.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Talking about China. So let's talk about Wang Yi. He has been extremely busy. So the Munich Security Conference, the conference itself, other than Wang Yi give a very interesting speech, I didn't see much else that's interesting to me. But there are lots of sideline meetings, right? So first, Wang Yi had a meeting with Blinken, okay, which I find interesting in the sense that it's not that long ago. Sullivan also had a meeting with Blinken with Wang Yi. Sullivan in China, they reported that Sullivan's meeting with Wang Yi in Bangkok was kind of strange in a way, because now Wang Yi had a scheduled visit to Bangkok to Thailand. That was a long time ago. But Sullivan's visit was not planned. It seems like all of a sudden Sullivan appeared there. So it's clearly he wanted to talk to Wang Yi. That's the interpretation in China. So Sullivan was eager to talk to Wang Yi, and now Blinken is also talking to Wang Yi. Also, if you look at the readout, they said that by his request, by Blinken's request, this meeting happened. So what is U.S. trying? I mean, U.S. is clearly eager to talk to China, but what is U.S. want China to do? China wants U.S. to do is always very clear: leave us alone, right? In terms of the Taiwan issue, we want to resolve it ourselves. In terms of South China Sea, we can handle this with our neighbors. So leave us alone. That China has always made that very clear. What exactly the U.S. want China to do?
The United States is in serious trouble. The war in Ukraine is going catastrophically wrong. The conflict in the Middle East, as we've just been discussing, is going catastrophically wrong. So what does the United States do? They want China's help. They want China to get them out of the mess they got themselves into. And that is why they're rushing around trying to meet Wang Yi. So they discover Wang Yi is going to Thailand. So Sullivan gets onto a plane, whizzes off to Thailand because it's incredibly important. I mean, it's so undignified, actually. I mean, it's awful, actually. I mean, that is not the way diplomacy ought to be conducted. So you gate crash, in effect, Wang Yi's meetings with people in Thailand. I mean, it's grubby, but anyway, that's what they do. That's why Blinken wants to talk to Wang Yi as well in Munich. Now, we've had lots of reports about what happened in Munich. They've had lots of reports in the Western media, including very, very important article in the Financial Times. Mood of complete despondency. Avdevka has fallen. Navalny is dead. We're without a plan. The Republicans in Congress, for whatever reason, they're not coming up with the money. The arms companies are coming back and telling us we can't provide Ukraine with the shells and guns and rockets and all of that it needs. The Ukrainians themselves going around looking very dejected. Zelensky makes an incredible speech in which he talks about betrayal by the West. He uses that word. One wonders what the Western leaders thought when they heard that word. All of that going on. And so what do? Well, they are out. They have no plan B. They can't really talk to the Russians because talking to the Russians would be profoundly humiliating. I mean, you've made out that Putin is Lucifer's representative on Earth. You can't just come along and tell him, well, we accept it was all wrong. We have to find, we need your help to get us out of this mess. So you talk to the Chinese, but then again, of course, you don't really know what to ask the Chinese to do. And that's the other fundamental problem. You look at these readouts, and you get the sense, both the American and the Chinese readouts, and the Americans come to these meetings with nothing. They have no real idea of what they want. They sense somehow that China is the country that has the strong cards. And they want China to play those cards in their favor. But they don't know how to ask the Chinese to do that because, of course, they're also terrified that the Chinese will say no, which quite likely they will. So it all looks ridiculous and ultimately unseemly. But that's what Western diplomacy has become reduced to. I mean, going back, by the way, to another program that we did, I think it was our last one, we're talking about the Chinese economy and the fact the stock market was crashing. All kinds of articles about the crash of the Chinese stock market. Now, of course, it's booming. So, I mean, narrative has to change. Which, I said to you at the time, it goes up and down because it's not really related to the economy in the way that it is in the West. But, now it's booming. So that whole narrative has also collapsed. What do? You have to speak to the Chinese. It shows, again, how powerful, in a sense, how important China has become and what a strong force it is in world affairs. But it also shows, again, the extent to which the West has lost agency. It's losing control.
And apparently, Wang Yi said something that got lots of attention in the Chinese social media. A lot of netizens discussing that. He said that there's an old Chinese saying. He told Blinken this time. He said, and there's an old Chinese saying, an act of kindness, no matter how trivial, is worth doing, while an act of evil, no matter how small, must be shunned. So uh, now he was talking about the U.S. treatment of the Chinese students. They got harassed everywhere in the airports. That seems to happening very often. So Wang Yi brought that up. But lots of the netizens were saying, well, there is a broader implications because it is clear that for the neocons and neoliberals, having all these wars, selling weapons, etc., that's not a big deal. For them, it's nothing. They don't feel like this is serious matter that you really need to, think a lot and stuff like that. Well, even from the perspective of the US, that these are not big deal. You are not supposed to do it anyway. So that's how the netizens kind of like one is advice to Blinken, if you want to solve your problem, that's what you should not do evil deeds, even it's trivial, even it's small.
You are absolutely. I mean, the netizens are obviously right. Now, obviously, I don't speak Chinese, so I don't understand perhaps fully the full meaning of these words. But I mean, one would assume that Blinken's interpreters will have explained it to him. One would like to think. Then one sometimes doubts, actually. But Wang Yi, who is an extremely clever man, knows exactly what he's saying. And if you follow Chinese officials very, very carefully, the thing about them is they always speak in a very calm and a very measured way, but they are always careful to say, to make clear what they think. And you're quite right. I mean, the Chinese are saying it's your deeds. You are measured by your deeds. Now, the problem is that the United States doesn't think in those terms. I think we discussed it in a recent program, that the Americans believe that they are virtuous and good, and that excuses their evil deeds. It doesn't really touch on them. And this is very much a part of their Protestant religious heritage. Whereas in China, it's your actions that define you. It's your actions that tell the world, to everybody, yourself included, whether you're good or bad. So there is this great philosophical disjunction. But obviously, what Wang Yi was saying isn't just connected to students, important though that issue is. I mean, we shouldn't discount it. It's also about the broader way in which the United States conducts policy.
Yeah. The other thing Wang Yi did is he met all kinds of people, right? He met David Cameron. He met, since it is in Germany, so he met Scholz and Baerbock, and then he met also Wittig and French foreign minister, etc. He met all kinds of Polish foreign minister, etc. Seems to me that's what also the netizens discussing, is that the whole purpose for all these meetings ultimately is he's trying to talk to some senses of the Europeans. So there are people even saying in the Chinese media that if there's one country really wants to see Europe doing well, it's actually China, because Europe and China doing so much trade. And Europe is a big client, a big customer of China. China wants to see its customer to be wealthy, right? To have money to spend. So is that what he's doing, trying to talk the Europeans into senses? Don't.
Yes, that's exactly what.
With us, it's enough you guys are doing. So let's do trade. Don't start the sanctions on us and stuff like that.
That is exactly what he's doing, and that is, by the way, not just Wang Yi at this meeting. It's what Chinese officials have been consistently doing for several years now. If you read the readouts of Xi Jinping's conversations with, say, German leaders, which happen on a fairly regular basis, you see that also. They're trying to get the Europeans to think rationally. And and that's something. I mean, it's good that somebody's doing it, because no one else is, to be frank about it. I mean, The Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar was also there, but he doesn't command the authority that Wang Yi does. I think the netizens are absolutely right, but note something else. Wang Yi obviously met all of these people, but he was only able to meet them because they all wanted to meet him. And that, again, is a sign of how important China has now become in global diplomacy. China is in a unique position. For the first time in its history, it is the single most important diplomatic power.
Yeah, and I think he's fully aware of that. That's why the other thing he did when he met also Mongolia, Argentina, Canadian foreign minister, right? So cross the line, I think his message is China is the force of stability in this
Yes.
turbulent world, right? He's trying to let everybody know about that, right?
This is absolutely correct. I mean, once upon a time, during the Cold War, during the unipolar period, the foreign minister that everybody wanted to meet was the American. No, they want to meet the Chinese. Notice that the Argentinians want to meet the Chinese. Now, bear in mind, the new Argentinian president, who I think is short of a few pieces, and but he is, his rhetoric is very pro-American, rather anti-Chinese. His foreign minister still wants to speak to Wang Yi. So you see, it's China has now become the key player in global diplomacy. I mean, one something that has never happened before in China's history. China used to be the key player in Asian diplomacy in the Pacific region, but never globally. I mean, it's not never been a situation where countries from every part of the world, foreign ministers from every part of the world, the foreign minister they want to talk to is China's. And that's partly, obviously, a reflection of China's power and the policies that China follows, the fact that China is this great force of stability. But it is also, and I have to say this, a tribute to Wang Yi's enormous diplomatic skills.
Mhm. Yeah, the Chinese media also think that way because they're thinking that he probably is the most high profile for a minister after Zhou Enlai. Now, Zhou Enlai, he's not engaged in this way. He's very high profile because he himself, I mean, the first generation, Communist Party, that certainly is very high profile, and he himself very attractive, very um, charismatic, right? So Zhou Enlai is that kind of a character. But in terms of really involved in the world peace, in world diplomacy, Wang Yi probably is very high profile, probably ever since China was established. Wouldn't you say?
I remember Zhou Enlai very well. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember, and he was a superb diplomat. I mean, he was um, the single most outstanding diplomat of his time,
Mhm.
without any question.
Yeah.
But of course, China at that time was much less powerful than it is today. And it didn't play the central role in international trade and business and economic activity that it does now. So, yes, Zhou Enlai was a superb diplomat, but he didn't speak with the authority, the global authority that Wang Yi does today. Um, but I would agree. I mean, since Zhou Enlai's time, Wang Yi has been the outstanding diplomat that China has produced.
Now, talking about also, he also met Kaliba, the
Yeah.
Ukrainian foreign minister, and Kaliba brought up the some kind of a peace summit in Switzerland that they are thinking to do, and China doesn't seem interested, right? My guess is Russia is not invited. I don't know all the detail, but if Russia is not invited, why would China be interested, right?
Well, the Chinese didn't attend the last of these summits. There's been a series of them going all the way back to August. China attended the first few, and then they said that this is pointless. The
Mhm.
Russians aren't here. the Ukrainians and the Western powers are putting forward proposals that make absolutely no sense. Why should we go on wasting our time? So the Chinese stayed away from the last one. And the latest word I've heard is that more and more countries, Brazil, India, are also saying that this really just doesn't make any sense anymore. And the result is that because so few countries agreed to turn up to this next meeting, it's been postponed, which
Okay.
is a way of saying that it's been cancelled. I think that, again, I think my impression of Wang Yi is that he's not somebody who lectures. I
No.
mean, he gives advice, but he's not somebody who comes along and wags his finger and says to people, you must do this and you must do that, as the Americans do that. I think it's Wang Yi's style at all. I think it's the Chinese style. But to the extent that he can, I think he probably is trying to explain to Kuleba, look, the Americans are just taking you on, along a course that's going to end in your destruction. Um, you've got to start thinking more realistically. And I have to say, Kuleba is not, he doesn't impress me as a very realistic man. I mean, he's one of the most disconnected from reality, even amongst the Ukrainian leaders, which is saying quite a lot. I've heard some rather odd stories about Kuleba's behavior in Munich. He was apparently very despondent and dejected, and that, well, let's put it like this, he was drinking rather a lot. Just saying.
And in the meantime, last time when we talked about, I brought up this, there's the 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Now there additional 2 are coming. So half of the US aircraft carrier fleets are now in Asia Pacific. So one of the analysts, Brian Hart, he's the fellow at the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He told South China Morning Post, he said that given the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, and the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the US military wants to signal that it can handle those situations while remaining focused on the priority theater, which is the Indo-Pacific. Is that what's going on? They still
Well,
want China to feel threatened.
yes, that's exactly what they want. But of course, in fact, the reality is it isn't half the American fleet, half the American carriers, which are in the Pacific. It is all of the American carriers that can work. Because the thing to understand, and this isn't controversial. These are very complex, huge warships. They need an enormous amount of time to keep them, running and operating, and they need massive maintenance. So at any what America may have 11 carriers, but only a proportion of them are ready for service at any one particular point in time. So what the US is concentrating in the Pacific is in fact its entire workable surface fleet. Now, what I think that conveys to China is not American strength, but American weakness. Because when you try to make a point too forcefully, what you are betraying is your own insecurity. I mean, there is no immediate crisis between China and the United States at this time. There isn't. So why concentrate 5 American carrier groups there? It's
Yes.
you're clearly trying too hard. And I think that China, sophisticated place as it is, understands that.
No. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, China is on high alert, but nobody think it's really mounted to anything other than just the theatrical kind of threat.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, I want to end our conversation in a lighter note and maybe relatively good news. I hope I can. So CDTN reported that France and Germany are funding a study that will explore how African artifacts ended up in the museums in Europe. And so the researchers are aiming to identify where exactly the items came from and how the museums acquired them, etc. Now, in China, we talked about this before. It's always a big topic, and people see that as a positive thing that France and Germany are willing to do that. Now, I got the impression in general, France and Germany are more willing to do these things, like more inclined to return these artifacts than Britain do. I mean, Germany already started doing that. They already returned some
Yeah.
artifacts back to China. I think France too. But Britain is very steadfast. No, we're not return anything. Is that right?
Well, I think there's a difference, and I'll tell you what it is. If you're talking about Germany, you must understand that the German colonial empire was on a very, very much smaller scale than the British and the French. I mean, Britain had an empire that extended across a quarter of the world, and they were sending expeditions to China. I think we discussed in a previous program how if you go to British country houses and stately homes, they are stuffed with things that were
Mhm.
plundered from China during, the expedition, the Elgin expedition of 1860, when the imperial palace, the summer palace, was burnt down, and also in the um, Allied expedition, the Western expedition of 1900, what the British refer to as the Boxer War, which is, by the way, every part of the story that the British say about that is wrong, but that's a big discussion which we'll just have to wait another time. But the British are stuffed with these things. Their museums are stuffed with our African artifacts, and they went right across Africa. They hoovered everything that they could take. I mean, British collectors, there, massive collections of Indian arts. I happen to know that the British Museum at any one time shows only a tiny fraction of 1% of the Indian art in its possession, because partly they don't want the Indians to know
Mhm.
how much they have. So there is a difference. Germany wasn't like that. It did have colonies in Africa, but they weren't rich colonies in the way that the British and the French, because the French also had a lot of colonies in Africa.
Yeah.
They had a presence in Pondicherry in India. There, you go to Shanghai. There was the French concession there. The French were very active. So the the British and the French, their museums are gorged with these things. Private individuals are gorged with these things. Germany is not. When they did acquire antiquities, sometimes they just took them. And I know a lot of Greek antiquities that they took. But sometimes they even actually paid for them. So it's different. So that's a fundamental psychological difference.
Yeah.
For the British, returning all of these things they took, all of this plunder, would be an admission, first of all, that it is plunder. That would then lead to a discussion of what they did during their empire. And that is not something that the British political class, and indeed many of the British people, are for the moment ready to do. The same, I think, to a certain extent applies in France. So I think be careful about what the French will do. The Germans don't have this colonial history behind them, so it is easier for them to do. Though even there, I suspect that there are limits. If you go to the museums in Berlin, for example, you will see that there's the bust of Queen Nefertiti that came from Egypt. You will see the Pergamon altar. That is an extraordinary structure that was taken from an ancient Greek city in Turkey. I can't really think the Germans are going to be very keen to return any of that.
But
But
don't
it's
you
good
think?
that people are talking about these things. Go on.
Yeah, because that's my next point is that more and more countries will be more vocal about this, right? Of course, the
Yeah.
China, India, but I think African countries, and Greece, I mean, there will be
Mm.
more and more country. This issue will keep on coming up. You can't hide from it, don't you think?
Absolutely. That is completely true. It is only a matter of time.
Yeah.
It is only a matter of time. And it is a very positive and very good thing that all of these countries are coming forward and are demanding their looted things back. And it is also a good thing because it reminds the Europeans of what they actually did. And again, it challenges this illusion, this belief, this entrenched belief that the Europeans were entitled to do these things because they were somehow superior about it. You know, I'll give you a sense of the change. This is an illustration of how the West is being forced to change its perspective about itself and its relation to the world and about the world in general. Now, in the late 1960s, in 1969, in fact, the BBC published a huge documentary series about culture, and it was called Civilization.
Okay.
Just Civilization.
Okay.
It is exclusively about the civilization of Western Europe.
Wow.
But it is called Civilization. I mean, what people in China and India and the Middle East were doing, that wasn't somehow part of civilization. You cannot make a program like that in Britain today. So we've been forced to change. It's happening very slowly. We're fighting back every inch of the way in Britain, but we are being forced to change.
I actually think it's, like you said, it's a good thing that you have these kind of a study, starting with the study, because like you said, lots of the artifacts they don't even know, etc. So what are those artifacts? Where are they, etc. Start with that, and then there's at some point there has to be some kind of a serious conversation, in my view, between the colonial powers and those countries, right? Maybe UNESCO could be the host or something, I don't know, but at some point this kind of a conversation need to take place.
You absolutely correct. But it is taking place. And I have to say something else. I mean, this is something that young people in Britain have become aware of and that they are talking about. I mean, it's taken a very, very long time, but there is now a spirit amongst young people. Remember, my wife is an academic, so she, lectures students. But young people in Britain, at least, are starting to become concerned and aware of these things, and internally, domestically, that conversation is now starting to take place.
Well, then that's good then, because then
Oh,
they're
it's
also,
completely good.
yeah, and in the meantime, France and Germany are sponsored this kind of study. That's a positive step, right? So I hope, we can see more positive news from that front. Yeah.
We will.
So
I have no
yeah,
doubt of it.
yeah.
I have absolutely no doubt of it. We will see more positive news, and there will be and there will be an accounting, and when that happens, that will be good for the Western societies as well.
As well, yeah.
It really will be. I mean, if you face the dark things from your past, that will purge you of them. So it's better to face up to this than to go on hiding these things away, keeping these things secret, pretending to yourself that you were always perfect, when deep down you increasingly know that you were not.
Okay, on that positive note, so that's all we have today. Again, very interesting to talk to you, very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia. My great pleasure. Look forward
Yeah.
to our next program next week.